Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Charlotte Robinson. I'm the president of the Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce, and so happy to have you here today for our monthly webinar. We'll begin today by acknowledging that the City of Thunder Bay is built on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples of Fort William First Nation, original signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And we recognize the significant contributions of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to our heritage, social, cultural, spiritual, and economic wealth. The Chamber is committed to a relationship with Indigenous peoples that is grounded on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in a spirit of reconciliation. So I'm so pleased to introduce today's presenter. Jessie Bogacki is the Education Coordinator for the Rainbow Collective of Thunder Bay and is going to provide us with a great wealth of information. Throughout the presentation, he is more than happy to take questions, so feel free to raise your hand if you have a question throughout, and then we'll also have a Q&A opportunity at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jessie.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. Are we all good? I had tested it with Charlotte.
We're good.
I'm going to take that as yes. Perfect. Okay, so Charlotte beat me to the land acknowledgement. So I just wanted to add as it relates to the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. So before colonization, those who were gender and sexual diverse, while not labeled as such, were not actually marginalized, but held to a high regard and had a valued role within Indigenous culture. So settler colonization forced assimilation through quite a number of ways, but I'll touch on two right here. The introduction of the Indian Act in 1876, which imposed traditional family structure. So by that, I mean heterosexuality. A man and woman were to get married. If it was not a man and a woman in that family structure, then any of the benefits, I know there were obviously a lot of negatives there too, that came with being status were removed. So the marriage did have to be between a man and a woman for that Indigenous status to remain. The other was the residential school system in 1831 to 1996, which forced the gender binary. And when we're talking about binaries in terms of gender, we're talking about the masculine, feminine. So those strict opposite roles. So they forced this in the residential schools through the way they dressed the children, the hairstyles that they gave them, the chores, and also that physical separation. So anyone who fit, in between those two roles, outside of those two roles, were forced into one of the two. So these events, as well as others, led to the erasure of Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer language, teachings, culture, as well as the role and roles, as well as the acceptance that came along with it. So while we're talking business today, always when we're talking about the gender and sexual diversity community, we are trying to bring it back to those values and acceptance that was present pre-colonization. Okay, so to our actual presentation today, Pride Month to practice year-round readiness for businesses. My name is Jessie Bogacki. I'm the workshop facilitator for Rainbow Collective. This is pretty well all I do now for Rainbow Collective, but I consider it the fun part. This is what I like to do. Feel free to ask questions because I am working off of two screens. If I'm really not seeing a hand raised, feel free to just jump in. You can see me, but I actually can't see you right now. So if Zoom decides to be nice to me and flag your hand at the top of my screen, it will. If it doesn't, feel free to just jump in and yell at me at any point. So quickly about Rainbow Collective, we were founded in March 2021. So we're just a group of individuals within the community, different parts of the community, who were just trying to create something different. Thunder Bay had a pride organization. which is amazing. But what we were looking to do was a bit more advocacy, be a bit louder on some topics. And for myself, I really wanted to get the education out there. So I needed a platform that would market as such, and it's been great since then. So we advocate for and advance gender and sexual diversity across Thunder Bay and Northwestern Ontario. We get pulled to some like I've even done a presentation virtually in Toronto. I would think that they had a lot of stuff available there, but we've had our reach, and it's been really great. And you will have pieces of what we've done for other groups, but this one is specifically tailored for what I was asked to do, and some like key takeaways for allyship. If you check out our website, we have a bunch of resources. So I didn't actually include any outside resources because we will link to the websites that have that information. There's a bunch of helplines specific to the community. We have a rainbow directory. So if you're, well, this is Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce, so you're in Thunder Bay, you can actually shop queer, trans, and two-spirit local if you check out our rainbow directory, and then you can see the list of website workshops that we offer. Our agenda for today is pretty simple. I'm going to very quickly describe the community and the communities within it. We're going to spend the bulk of the time on the acts of allyship. And then again, question and answer at the end. But if you have questions throughout, feel free to send them my way ahead of time. So first, so that we understand what we're talking about, we're just going to make sure that we have that basic information about the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. First, for this acronym, you might have seen a different one. You might have gone to some other trainings, some great trainings. It doesn't mean that what I have is wrong and what they have, or that what they have is wrong. This acronym just changes over time. This is considered like one of the more inclusive ones. It's a little bit longer. It has a plus. It has a 2S at the beginning, as Two-Spirit and Indigenous people were our first peoples. So it's generally acceptable, but you may see others. There's no governing body that decides what acronym we use and which one we don't. So they're just as okay for folks to use. In terms of what they mean, the 2S is for Two-Spirit. There's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning, as some folks are kind of, got their toes dipped into the community, but they don't really have that language, or maybe they don't use a label that kind of encompasses that. Intersex, when somebody is born, often we will say girl or boy, but intersex is kind of that ambiguous genitalia. They might have different chromosomes from XX or XY. There's a variety of different combinations. They're just as common as people with red hair. So there's a lot of intersex people. It's just something we don't talk about all that often. Asexual, aromantic, and agender. That A basically stands for lack of, or like less. So lack of sexual attraction, or like maybe a lesser degree than one might typically think that folks have. Again, all of these are some sort of continuum, but this is just some basic language and what the actual acronym stands for. And then that plus is just the rest of the gender and sexual diversity community's unique identities and types of attraction. You've likely heard some other language that isn't included. We do want to encompass that, but as most people say, we do kind of want the acronym to stop somewhere. Are there any terms here that you want me to explain a little bit further, or any terms that you've heard that you don't see here that you want me to touch on before we move on to the more business side of things? I'll just pop into here to make sure I'm not seeing any hands. No. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to do for definition in the community itself. I was told that the folks coming likely had a general understanding, so I hope we can move on from here. Now, Quickly, the stats. So whether you're concerned about staffing, employee well-being, customer satisfaction, or just the dollar amounts, an inclusive workplace is good for business. Consumers are more likely to spend money on a business that is known to be more inclusive. So inclusive workplaces that recruit, retain, and advance 2S LGBTQIA plus employees increase employee recruitment, retention, engagement, innovation, and overall business organizational success. 1 in 5 2S LGBTQIA plus workers experience workplace discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. 30% of openly 2S LGBTQIA plus people leave their workplaces because they feel unwelcome or unsupported by management, and 5.4 times higher employee retention if the workplace is inclusive. So again, no matter what your thoughts are about the community, being inclusive, being accepting, taking some of these steps that we will talk about is good for business, is good for your employees. These are just some of the stats, but we could have gone through this, through tons and tons of stats about how this is good for the community and for business. So here are the acts of allyship for businesses that we will go through. And I'm going to go through all 5 of these individually. So don't worry right this second, but these are kind of like the steps that I thought we could take. A lot of the times we're talking about like, what can I physically do? Like, what can I do to show? But I think that really comes as the final piece. And there's a lot more that we need to explore before we get there. So within all these categories, I will give you some takeaways of what you can do. Again, you have these slides. If you don't already, they're in the chat, and they will be emailed to you after the presentation with the recording. So anything that's on the slide, don't feel like you have to write it down. But allyship is a verb. It's why it's written like this. It's not, how to be an ally. It's not something that's self-proclaimed. It's about holding yourself and others accountable, listening to the experiences and perspectives of the community, and building that trust. You got to practice what you learn and intervene in situations and be consistent about that. And also, it's about taking that feedback to think about the impact of your actions or words. So that impact versus intention. Sometimes when we say things, we mean, we have the best of intentions, but it really depends what that impact on the community is. So we're starting with self-reflection here. A few definitions for us. When we're reflecting, we really need to think about the bias and privilege that we hold. We all hold it, myself included. And that doesn't make us bad people. Bias is prejudice against or preference for a person or group of people. This is often implicit, meaning we're not consciously aware of it. If we're discriminating, we're not doing it intentionally. Take, for example, a homeless adult. And I'm not saying what do you think, but what are some of the things that we will often hear about that person's situation? Just if somebody says that person is homeless, what are some of the things that society thinks? Anybody want to give me some examples? And I'm not taking it as your personal opinion.
They should get a job.
Yeah, they should get a job. Anything else? What maybe got them there?
Addiction.
Yeah, that's so usually some pretty negative stuff. Maybe sometimes it's right, but that's not people. That's very it's just one way of looking at things. When we think about this community in particular, I know even in Thunder Bay, it sucks to say that trans youth are being bullied in school, more specifically in high school, but it can happen at younger ages. It happens within all the school boards. I'm not saying like people have the best of intentions, but often what that ends up being is that trans youth drops out of school. It's often more detrimental to them than the bully themselves. I can't speak to all the reasons why that is, but that's what happens. So Well, this community that we're speaking of make up about 10% of the population. They make up 40% of the homeless population. So yeah, you might see an adult there. Maybe they are even into drugs at that point. But what you're really seeing is a child who was in a system that was meant to protect them, meant to help them grow and learn, and failed them. And when you don't make it through high school, it's really hard to get a job or to be successful in society. And it's not for lack of trying or necessarily that they weren't smart. That's not everybody's reality either, but this is something that is happening more often than not. So it's often, situations beyond their control, and sometimes due to their identities, that creates that sort of situation. And that's just one example of bias. Privilege is that unearned advantage that one person or group of people have over another. So this privilege isn't something that people ask for, nor should they feel bad about it. But it is important that we acknowledge it and work to rewrite the policies and procedures that create it. So we need to make space for others to have opportunities, knowing that that doesn't necessarily take opportunities away from us. Now, there are different types of privilege. For example, take a white woman. Men have privilege, therefore, she does not have privilege due to being female. However, as a white person, she does have privilege due to race or the color of her skin. When we're speaking about the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, heterosexual people hold privilege due to their sexual identity, and cisgender, for lack of a better term, we'll say folks who aren't trans, uh, have privilege due to their gender identity aligning with their sex assigned at birth. And again, what this privilege looks like is different for everybody. It is situational. There's not a perfect hierarchical ladder of exactly who has privilege over who, but it can result in different advantages in different scenarios. Now, when we go over the struggles of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, we have to know that these challenges are increased by the multiple identities that an individual holds. So intersectionality is the framework to understanding how multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So it means that something connects or exists with something else. The multiple identities that someone has cannot be understood separately. This is where I say math doesn't math. 1+1 doesn't equal 2. 1+1 equals 3, 4. They overlap and combine and build off of each other. So for someone who is both Black and queer, they cannot talk about their experience being queer without taking into account the challenges that the color of their skin and culture add to that experience. Now, if we factor in gender identity, class, ability, among other things, when it comes to intersectionality in that example, this person does not experience challenges because they are Black and others because they are queer. They face challenges as a Black queer person, and that is increasingly difficult. So again, I think this reflection piece before moving on to anything else within the community is the most important, because if we're doing things and at the back of our head we're saying, yeah, but these people don't do that, these people don't do that, and like, I've had a hard time too, which you have. This has nothing to do with how hard somebody's life is. It's just those challenges that are added because of a specific identity that somebody holds that can make things even more difficult. And remembering that when we're fighting for the rights of this community, that we have to include all other marginalized groups, or we're always leaving out part of the community, because there are gender and sexual diverse people who are Indigenous, who are disabled, for example. And if we don't also advocate for those folks, then we're not capturing the entirety of the community. So first things first, and I think folks might have thought a little bit as I was speaking, but even like after this presentation, just take some time. We all have biases to some degree, but kind of working with that, and just how that plays into these other aspects. So that would be step number one for businesses and for folks to do at an individual level. Now, kind of one of the easier, most known ways to be inclusive within the community is to use inclusive language. So I'm going to speak to a few different things here, starting with gender neutral language. There's easy ways to change how we speak, how we address people that is just more inclusive, and doesn't knowingly exclude folks or unknowingly. For example, when we address a group, instead of ladies or gentlemen, we're walking into a room and saying, "Hi guys," we can say, "Welcome team." I'd like to give you the opportunity to think of some other neutral ways that we can address a group. Any examples from you folks?
Just broad, like welcome everyone, good to see everyone, without getting into any other specific gender topics.
Yeah, everyone. Exactly. Anything else that anyone else here has? It's nothing that we wouldn't already know. There's no real special language here. It's just about you know, being aware of it and using different language. Okay, I'm not hearing anything else. People, I said folks as I was talking and realized I gave one away. We want to be fancy, distinguished guests. Anything that's not, blatantly pointing out genders. There's a lot of other gender neutral language that we can use, but that one's the one I would say is a good introduction in terms of, how easy it is to change our language to make sure that everybody is included. And even when you're working within your teams, especially bigger teams, not making that assumption that we know kind of how everybody identifies. And we'll get into that a little bit more. In terms of names and pronouns, the first thing, use the name that people want you to use. You may have a different name on some documents legally as part of a business. Maybe that's for staff. Maybe that's for clients. And that's one thing. And sometimes there's no way around that, and that's fine. Legal name is legal name. But verbally, there should be no reason not to use the name, not to use that, or to use that name if somebody doesn't want you to. Everybody has a name that they want you to go to. Maybe there's, even some folks don't like specific nicknames. If they don't like that name for themselves, don't use it. It's as simple as that. If we need to do paperwork, we do it on the paperwork. But when addressing folks directly, use the name that they want you to use. And that doesn't usually end up being overly complicated. When we talk about pronouns, as it relates to gender and sexual diversity, we are referring to third-person pronouns. Unfortunately, the only ones that are gendered. Can't fix that now, I guess. Well, there's a workaround, obviously. That's what we're here to talk about. And this is what we use when we're talking about somebody else. Often somebody who's not present, but not always. We use these instead of using a person's name. Be careful with pronouns about saying the word preferred pronouns, as they are not preferred. They just are their pronouns. The only way to know what pronoun somebody uses is to ask for them, or for them to tell you. But we do have kind of two options here. Again, I'm not going to make assumptions about how your businesses work, although I've seen a bit of names and I'm familiar with some of them. There's kind of two different ways we address this. First, we use gender neutral pronouns, they, them, as best practice when we aren't sure what pronoun somebody uses. So say you have a storefront business and somebody comes in and for some reason you have to address them in third person. You would say, hey, can somebody help them find whatever it is they're looking for? We would use gender neutral pronouns because at that point they're a stranger to us and we haven't asked them. And if this is a type of place where a lot of people are flowing in and out, and this isn't maybe a person who's a regular at this point, that's where we might leave it. We would just use gender neutral pronouns. This is what you're going to use for someone that you don't have a close relationship with. It's not a good idea to ask them if you're just curious, if we don't need to know. One thing to remember when using they, them pronouns is to use a plural linking verb. So instead of saying they are, instead of saying they is, we are going to say they are. So we're using it as if we were talking about multiple people. So in simple terms, they is used to replace he and she, and them is used to replace him and her. That would be how we would use those. Now, our second way of addressing this situation, and this is how I would recommend you address staff, your regular clients that are maybe coming in every day, business partners, whatever that may look like for you, is to ask what pronouns they use and use them. We're not going to resort to neutral. We have a relationship with this person. Let's get their pronouns. If we're going to get their name, let's get their pronouns. So this is what you're going to do with most folks that you meet. And even, your family, your friends. This is what I would recommend. All you have to do is politely ask what pronouns you use. And while there's nothing wrong with asking when I say this, some people find that that's really invasive. So it doesn't have to be done. There's nothing wrong with it. You can blatantly ask. But if you're not comfortable with that, it doesn't actually need to be in the form of a question. As you are meeting somebody, especially for the first time, you can get their pronouns by offering yours first. Hi, my name is Jesse. My pronouns are they, them. I'm not asking a question, but when I say my name, what's the first thing you do? You say your name. When I say my pronouns, that would likely be a good indication that if you wanted to provide me with pronouns, you would then do it. Does it always work that perfectly? Of course not. But that would be kind of the first step in order to have those conversations. And it feels like a little bit less pressure on likely both ends. So the best way to offer and ask for pronouns is just to not make it about pronouns. Just make it about getting to know somebody. It's just about respect and making sure that we know how to have a conversation with each other without unintentionally using the wrong language. Now, no matter how great you are at this, sometimes we make mistakes. We are human. And I think one of the things that stops people the most from engaging with the community is that fear of making a mistake. Yeah, someday, somehow, somebody might get mad at you. But if you are being intentional about what you're doing, respectful, and you made a mistake, imagine how many people already that day weren't. It's not about you. It's not personal. It might hurt. But if you make a mistake and say they call you out, my pronouns are she, you would say, thank you. It's actually a lot better. It's not bad to say sorry, but usually when we say sorry, we kind of overdo it. And it becomes about us, and then they have to say it's okay. So it's not the end of the world, but it's also not okay. So we can say thank you. She said blah 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 blah. So just make that correction. Repeat your sentence the correct way, and it's as simple as that. Nobody needs to stay awake all night that they made a mistake. Just and do better going forward. People will notice. And remember that you might have to unlearn somebody's old pronouns before really getting to get used to their new ones. Any questions, because this tends to be quite the topic for folks, on pronouns or even gender neutral language in general before I move to the next slide?
Jesse, I have a question.
Yeah.
If an individual signs emails with multiple names, and then when you meet them, provides both names, how do you know, like, is it okay to ask which would you prefer? Would that be acceptable? Or what would be the appropriate way to proceed in that situation?
Yeah, so there are cases where the one question just doesn't really cut it with anything. Sometimes when you ask people questions, again, people usually if there's like some annoyingness to there, it's not you. It's just they've done it a lot. It's always better to ask than to assume. So in that case, yes, I would say, is there a time where I would use this name over this name? Do you want me to use both, or is there one you want me to resort to? Same goes for pronouns. There are people with multiple pronouns. A lot of the times people like that you use both. Sometimes they're just okay, and like some people will use one and somebody will use the other, but there's no way to for sure know unless you ask. And 9 times out of 10, somebody is going to be very happy that you asked, that you noticed, and that you followed through. And that way there's no awkwardness, kind of guessing games, just quick follow up, or even just pointing it out of I noticed this. Which one should I use? Or are there any scenarios where that wouldn't be acceptable? When this is business, but when we talk about the schools, things like this come up. They have a name that they might be comfortable with at the school, but hey, and that is my name. That's what I want to go with. But my parents don't know. So, please don't use that with my parents. I know that's very different than the business, but they're, just gathering that information. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to know why. You just need to know, what do I use? Both, or pick one. And those are pretty well the only options that you're going to be given, or a potential exclusion. So yeah, always better to ask than assume. And I would say that, if you do any DEI course with any group, they will pretty well say the same thing, because we're really good at making assumptions. And it's great until we're wrong. And you just don't know until you know. And that's when it gets really awkward. Any other questions about pronouns? Okay. Definitely, again, an opportunity at the end, but I just won't. Usually when we go over that topic, just want to make sure that people, understand what our fallback is. And that really, these will become a lot less awkward as it's just becoming more ingrained in society, especially the email signatures. You just see that a lot more, and it's just not quite. It doesn't have to be the same conversation. In that case, if you already have them, it is a little bit different when you have two. But say that person only had one, you don't even have to ask a question in person ever. It's all that information is there. You already know they know what pronouns are. If you both had email signatures, like that conversation is done. And there would be no reason, unless you saw something that contradicts it, to ever have a verbal conversation about it. And you don't have to, unless things change for that person. All right. So that's kind of like our second step, is getting that language piece, making sure that we're not intentionally creating harm, and that we understand, how to use neutral language and pronouns. Because whether somebody who uses they them pronouns or not, you will be speaking to strangers, and you will have to use it at some point in order to not make assumptions. Otherwise, you will always just be making assumptions. All right. Then we need to change the workplace culture. Now, this plays into specific people within an organization more than others. Here we are talking a little bit more about people in power, with more power within the workplace, but not exclusively. There are ways to do this at any level. But, first and foremost, if we don't have a leader who is inclusive, sometimes it doesn't matter what the staff are pushing for, because all those sort of policies and such just won't come into play. So it's really important for that leader to kind of practice what they're preaching. If you want your staff to go to DEI training, you should probably go, so that you understand and you can hold folks accountable. In terms of hiring practice, for myself, I actually add a question. Do I have the best question? No, I'll give you my example though. That asks about diversity. I am trying to see that people know how to communicate with people who are different from them, that they are capable of working with them, that they're capable of being respectful, just based on how they answer an interview question. So, does that person that you are going to hire align with the culture that you're aiming for? Because you can, once you decide to do this, it's easier to make sure you're getting the right people in than to take somebody who's really not inclusive and try to change their mind. That's a really hard thing to do, and in some cases, impossible because logic isn't always a factor. So, for myself, I asked, please speak to your experience working with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, and or persons with a disability. And they just start talking. Um, I worked with, Indigenous folks here. You decide how you want those questions to be answered. But, if they have nothing to say, like I've never worked with those people. I've never engaged, like everybody's engaged with people who are diverse. So, see, it's not a question asking about people's specific identity, but I've had people, be like, I'm part of this community. A question that you can't actually ask. I didn't ask, and I just kind of gathered information. And sometimes they have, that lived experience piece that places are looking for. Again, that you can't blatantly ask in the question. But this is just to piece together, where are they at? Do they align? And it doesn't have to be that question. You can tailor that to however it works for your organization, but just a really good idea to, filter people out who aren't aligning towards the goals of the organization. Equitable promotions. I'm not necessarily saying unless it is a practice, and it does depend on an organization. For example, maybe an Indigenous organization is prioritizing Indigenous folks, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just don't decide what position somebody should have based on stereotypes. If you think that person's personality, they probably wouldn't like it. You never know. If some person is deserving, offer to them, have that conversation. Don't weed anybody out just based on some assumptions and stereotypes in the workplace. But I'm not necessarily saying you have to hire the most diverse person for promotion. Maybe they're not the best person for the job. But just be conscious that you're not, taking anybody out of a position that they might be very deserving of. And empower diverse voices. So I am part of the community that I'm speaking about today. I like doing education. I'm very open to talking about myself as well as the community as a whole. No question is a bad question. I get asked very personal questions. Don't care. That's fine. Everybody's curious, but not everybody feels that way. So if you have people part of any marginalized group, but for example, for this case, somebody who's gender or sexual diverse in your organization, and you are looking to change something about diverse, how your organization deals with, workplace culture, policies, whatever it may be, in regards to gender and sexual diverse people, it's not a bad idea to at least give those folks a chance to have a say. It affects them directly. They have the lived experience. They know about the community. Some of this might directly impact them. Give them a chance to have a say. It doesn't mean that they want to do the work, and if they don't, then leave it at that. Or if they just say, just run it by me after. It's not the community's job to do the work, but it is our job to at least include them. So I think keep that in mind, that a lot of workplaces already have a lot of diversity within them, and a lot of knowledge on how to deal with inclusivity within the workplace. So before we go with all our ideas that potentially come, let's see what they think. And if they don't want to be included, then you did your job on there. So that is how we would change the culture, and just, making sure that all the voices are heard, just in a general day-to-day basis as well. Not only when there's change, but, say it all the time. Who do we talk over in meetings? Making sure they are heard. And then we want to look into maybe updating our policies. Okay, so we've done some self-reflection. We're using the right language. We're kind of changing the culture, but now we want like, how do we do this? What does this look like on paper? We need policies. We have policies for everything. So the easiest way, first of all, to make the policies that you have inclusive is to change all the he/she to they in your policies. Quick, just language. Now everybody is included. That's just one piece. Now we want to consider creating or updating our code of conduct and or anti-discrimination policy to include the community and include, what that looks like to go against it, what maybe accountability looks like, what are we tolerating, what are we not. Because most places will already have some sort of policy, either one or the other. But just making sure you have that in place. Okay, now we've decided what we aren't going to deal with. How do we deal with that? How do we get that information? A lot of people have a really hard time speaking up in the workplace because, you don't want to be the one that says so-and-so did this. Have a complaint procedure in place to report anything. And I mean anything that goes against the code of conduct or anti-discrimination policy. How are we dealing with this? What does that look like going forward? We don't want to wait until something happens. Yes, there's a certain case by case that we want to do. There's a lot of complex things that come about when we're dealing with people, but at least have something figured out so you don't need to do it after the fact. If you have a dress code, make it inclusive. There shouldn't be different requirements for men or women. We should make sure that dress codes take into account different religions. Inclusive dress codes are good for everybody. Just making sure that we're not excluding some people in there, or just, maybe don't have a dress code. I think there's a certain degree of dress codes that are we don't have the same type of separation that there used to be, but maybe at least look at that. Maybe in practice it might have changed, but in policy it might not have. And then make DEI education mandatory, diversity, equity, inclusion education. And I don't just mean for this community, I mean for all communities. It's really important. And when we don't know, sometimes there's that fear that leads to, not handling situations the way that maybe we should be. I think when we understand where somebody comes from, let's go back to homeless population, again, assuming that you didn't actually think the things that you said, was the point of it. And people do, but when we really start to understand like what that looked like, what the situation was, it's usually a lot different than what it looks like. So updating policies and enforcing them speaks to accountability. It creates a safer space for those who are diverse, but it creates a safer space for everybody. We're all intertwined. So updating those policies or pushing to update those policies can be really important. And now for some people, the more fun stuff, this is the stuff that people see a little bit more. But I do think that some of those earlier pieces maybe have a bigger impact in some cases, but those physical changes, okay, now we have all this, we understand, we've changed in the back end. Now, what does that look like? So, it doesn't necessarily, because we do like flags and celebrating Pride. It doesn't have to look like that. Making your inclusion known could be funding local organizations that promote inclusivity or support it openly, and avoiding organizations that don't, that we know actively discrimination against the gender and sexual diversity community or other communities. Post your code of conduct or inclusion policies policies for staff or clients. Like, make your stance known. This is what we tolerate. This is what we don't. I think that can be a lot more impactful than necessarily just throwing a rainbow on something and saying I support you. It's those actions that are really really helpful. You can modify forms. For example, a client intake, you can add pronouns to forms. Again, you don't have to have that discussion, and remove unnecessary gender information. If you don't need to know, you don't need to know. For example, not many places need to know somebody's sex assigned at birth. You don't need to know what a baby looked like. All you need to know is who they are right now and how to address them. You don't, or mostly just how to address them. How do I speak with this individual? Might be a little bit different in, say, like a medical profession where some of that information could be more helpful. But if you don't need to know, it's none of our business. We just don't need to know. It's just about respect. It's not about identifying everybody and like, are you part of this group or are you not? We already talked about it, but add pronouns to name tags and email signatures. It's a really easy way to say, I know pronouns, here are mine. It's an open invitation for somebody to give you theirs. It's a really easy way to avoid the conversations, again, with nothing actually being wrong with the conversation itself. And you're just acknowledging that you know what pronouns are and the communities, and about the communities that they affect most. Washrooms could be a whole discussion on their own. So, sometimes building a new washroom is not the easiest thing to do. But you may be able to change some signage, again, some policies on how we navigate washrooms in the organization, that can make those a little bit more inclusive. Of course, a gender neutral washroom, single stall would be amazing. Some of you might be dealing with really old buildings where it just doesn't work out quite the way we would like it to. So in summary, we had our self-reflection, we examined bias privilege, and considered how that intersectionality compounds. We've used inclusive language, talked about gender neutral language, proper names, and asking for pronouns. Changed the workplace culture. We're choosing leaders who model inclusivity, give equitable promotions and hiring, and empower the diverse employees within our organization. We've updated policies, code of conduct, anti-discrimination, complaint procedure, dress code, and implemented mandatory DEI education. And then we implement the physical changes. We modify our forms. We add pronouns to name tags and email signatures, and we make our spaces more, specifically, we spoke about bathrooms, more gender neutral. Now I'm going to bring us to the question page. So all I have here, just for our contact information, is our organization, Rainbow Collective of Thunder Bay. The email doesn't go directly to me, but anything regarding this will be forwarded to my personal email. So feel free to contact Rainbow Collective at info@rainbowcollectiveofthunderbay.com. Or again, check out our website. We have made some resources, but a lot of those resources were already out there. So we're just linking to other outside resources that folks have already created. We're not reinventing anything that's already out there. Now, if we have any questions, we want to speak about, any of the slides, the community you have. I don't even care if we get more personal, this person in my life, so and so. Any questions are good by me. You have the floor.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. Anybody got a question? Just shout out or put it in the chat if that's more comfortable, whatever works for you.
And now the chat is right up in front of me, so perfect. I can see you really good.
Looks like
you even just let me know if that was helpful. If you would recommend, again, we do a lot of presentations to business. The ask was a little bit different for this one. So in terms of how the steps were laid out was different. So if you found that helpful, please let me know as well. So I didn't really want to jump right to the physical changes.
I was curious if I saw that the session was being recorded, and I did miss the first bit, so I was wondering if if I'm able to access the recording. like
we'll
the
be
slide.
sharing the recording as well as the slides with you after the event.
Okay, perfect. Is that just gonna get like emailed out then?
We'll email it out. Yeah,
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
But just in
All
case
right.
folks are zooming up, I also want to thank you for coming in and listening today. That was great. Go ahead, Carol.
Okay, thank you so much. If there's no other questions, then I know everybody's probably running off to the next meeting. So I want to say thank you so much, Jesse, for sharing your insights and your expertise to help to ensure that our businesses have the tools that they need to be inclusive and welcoming to the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. Before we conclude this afternoon, I want to just highlight a couple of chamber events that are upcoming. A great opportunity for engagement and connection. Our next Small Business Solutions Summit webinar is going to be on Tuesday, June the 23rd. And the topic for next month is 2026 Trends in Social Media Marketing. So watch for registration. It'll open next week for that. And then our Shift Young Professionals Network is hosting a picnic and putt event on June the 25th, and registration information for that is already up on our website. So for information on any upcoming events, you can go to tbchamber.ca and get all of the details, and of course, reach out to our office at any time. Again, thank you so much to everyone for participating today, and thanks again to Jesse for a great presentation. We will send out the recording and the slides later on this afternoon, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, and
Thank
thanks for having
you.
me.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care. Bye-bye.